Well, let's get some more analysis on where we stand with regards to the peace talks and the overall situation in the region. We can cross to London and speak to Hugh Lovatt, who is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We heard from the Israeli Prime Minister a little earlier on this evening, Benjamin Netanyahu, calling this deal in parts bizarre, delusional, were some of the words he used about this proposed ceasefire. Clearly, it was far from being acceptable to him. I mean, how do we reconcile two sides that are so far apart?
Well, one way to try to reconcile the positions of both Hamas and the Israeli government is, of course, through shuttle diplomacy, which is what the state of Qatar, Egypt, and now somewhat belatedly the United States are attempting to do by talking to both sides and trying to come up, I suppose, with a bridging proposal, and that will continue. But the real issue is that the Israeli government, and more specifically Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, quite clearly is not in the mood to accept any compromise or any ceasefire deal at the moment. And I think the problem is that so Netanyahu is saying that he will accept nothing less than Hamas's total eradication. That is simply not going to happen. So in effect, what the Israeli Prime Minister is saying and vowing is basically continued perpetual war in Gaza, and likely doing that also for his own political survival.
Indeed. I mean, but do you think he means it to the letter, or is this a negotiating tactic to perhaps get all sides to rethink the terms and conditions that are being presented up until this point?
I think it's largely symptomatic of the paralysis within the Israeli political system, and more specifically within the Israeli government, because of the ideological contradictions between some of its members, between the far-right members of Netanyahu's coalition and those who were more centrist within the coalition. The Israeli government has not been able to put forward any real proposal for what comes after the fighting in Gaza. So this is a huge issue. But going back to Netanyahu, I mean, this is cynical, but this is also, I think, needs to be said. Netanyahu's political survival, to a large extent, depends on the continuation of a state of war. Once the war is over, it is quite clear, and I think there is a consensus within the Israeli political system, that Netanyahu will be ejected from power. Once he's out of power, he will be vulnerable to ongoing criminal investigations against him.
As well as we heard earlier from our correspondent in the region, an inquiry into the failures, the security failings that made the 7th of October possible. We're looking at an empty podium at the moment in Jerusalem, I believe, at the US Embassy there. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, on his 5th visit to the region since the 7th of October. It looks, doesn't it, like he's going to go home empty-handed.
And that might not be that surprising, unfortunately, given the very entrenched positions of the Israeli government. Now, of course, there is a lot happening behind the scenes that we're not necessarily seeing. Quite clearly, the American administration is increasing pressure, albeit privately and somewhat belatedly, on the Israeli government to not only to start to move towards de-escalation, or at least moving into a new phase in the war in Gaza and towards a ceasefire, but also trying to develop this day-after plan for what comes after once fighting finishes, which is the core issue. So a lot of this is happening in the background. But I think one gets a sense that American frustration with Israel is increasing. And I think that's, again, quite symbolically on display at the moment. The fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu held his own press conference just now, and that Secretary Blinken will be holding his press conference shortly. And both are doing this separately. So there's obviously a lot of tensions at play behind the scenes.
Yeah, and we've heard Netanyahu making comments to the effect that he's not even comfortable with the people mediating between the two sides. He made some pretty disparaging comments about the intentions of the Qatari delegation only last week, I think it was. I mean, could there be a plan B up somebody's sleeve here that, okay, well, let's put the ceasefire idea to one side for the time being, but at least some sort of a humanitarian deal to improve and increase the amount of humanitarian aid getting through to people that we saw in that report who are clearly living in extremely desperate conditions.
Indeed. And I think we need to differentiate between two things. The first is a pause in fighting. And we had that before Christmas. There was a limited pause that allowed for the release of some Israeli hostages in return for the release of Palestinian prisoners and a surging of humanitarian aid into Gaza. I think that is possible to envisage at some point in the coming weeks. There's a lot of details that need to be negotiated in terms of how many hostages will be released, how many Palestinian prisoners will be released, how long that pause in fighting will last. I think there is a possibility of an agreement on that. The bigger issue, and this is, I think, what is holding up talks now, indirect talks between Hamas and Israel, is what comes after this pause. Now, Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu are very clear that they want to resume fighting in Gaza once this is over, to eradicate Hamas, whereas Hamas is now pushing for a permanent ceasefire to come after this pause. So the pause would last a number of weeks, and during that time, Hamas's plan is that the parties would then try to establish a framework for what comes after the fighting ends and how to actually lock in a longer-term ceasefire.
But I mean, hasn't Netanyahu boxed everyone into an impossible corner here by saying that the only deal we'll accept is a deal with a group that will have been eradicated? So there won't be a deal. I mean, it's as simple as that, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think this is the problem, and this has been the problem basically from day one, is that the Israeli government has been setting out, at least publicly, a set of objectives that it cannot meet militarily. We can all agree that, my position is certainly that Hamas should have no role in Gaza's future in terms of Gaza's governance and security. But it is also clear that Israeli military action in Gaza will not be able to eradicate Hamas. Hamas will remain there. The only way to extract it will be through this a political track. And I think the problem is not by setting out these unrealistic aims. Netanyahu has indeed cornered himself. He's not enabling the Israeli political and public opinion to move in a direction that could start to allow for concessions. But it's also completely at odds with what Israeli politicians and military officials say, mostly privately, but sometimes also publicly. Plenty of Israeli officials do recognize that Israel will not be able to eradicate Hamas, and that actually it will be more about weakening and degrading the movement.
Okay, and just lastly, before I let you go, because it doesn't look like we're going to get Antony Blinken speaking while you're still here. It seems to be rather later than we'd expected. Is there anything the US could do, or any of Israel's other regional allies and future regional allies, and there I'm talking obviously about countries like Saudi Arabia, which hold considerable clout now in the region. Is there anything they can do to step up the pressure on Netanyahu and get him to say, look, this cannot go on. Your goals are unrealistic. We've got to come to some sort of a conclusion here, because not least for the Biden administration, they're trying to win an election in 8 months from now, and this isn't helping in the slightest.
Indeed. I think one of the bigger issues is that up until now, the Biden administration has not been willing, in my mind, to apply sufficient pressure on the Israeli government. They've until now adopted this so-called bear hug strategy, which is trying to hug Netanyahu close, and by engaging and supporting him, trying to moderate his views and the conduct of the Israeli military in Gaza. I would argue that after almost 30,000 dead Palestinians, that strategy has not worked. And we are now starting to see the American administration apply a bit more pressure. Clearly, there needs to be even more than that in conjunction with European states and regional states. That is ultimately also about trying to demonstrate that there is accountability over Israeli actions in Gaza by supporting international accountability mechanisms such as the ICC and ICJ. These are all important ways of signaling and putting pressure. That's the first stage. The next stage is to really start to grapple with the Israelis, but also indirectly with Hamas, about what comes after a pause in fighting. How can a ceasefire in Gaza become more sustainable? That will require a recognition of hard realities, including the fact that Hamas will have to be factored in. No matter how atrocious its actions, it will remain there. But it will also require a reform of the Palestinian Authority, which is also very difficult. But even more difficult, but more important, is how to actually re-energize an Israeli-Palestinian political track. Without that, there will be no sustainable future for Gaza, and there will be no sustainable peace or security for either Israelis or Palestinians.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. Hugh Lovatt, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you very much for being with us on France 24 once again.